In a second win this week for the trans community, a Florida judge ruled Wednesday that the state's ban on Medicaid coverage of gender-affirming health care is unconstitutional. According to Axios, plaintiffs sued the state after it enacted the ban last summer. But Judge Robert Hinkle found Florida's rules are not consistent with the Constitution and violate federal law. Under Hinkle's orders, the state will have to resume coverage of hormone therapy and puberty blockers.
Meanwhile, some trans patients in Tennessee are on alert after being put on notice that the Vanderbilt University Medical Center is sharing their personal information with the Tennessee Attorney General's office. The LGBTQ community is bewildered at the state's inquiry into the trans community.
You are supposed to have a right to privacy, and you are supposed to have a right to health care and to be able to trust your doctor. And no one, for any purposes, should ever have that trust misguided or misused just because of state interest in politics.
The Attorney General's office maintains it needs this information as part of a medical billing investigation. So it does sound quite fishy. I've worked for research groups when I was in data-driven policy research labs where we were handling very sensitive, personally identifiable government information. Usually what happens when this information is transferred is that it's made anonymous. And the prospect that it was not in this case is a bit concerning. A lot of research happens at private universities. And so folks aren't really feeling safe when that data is being transferred and potentially used by governments that are not particularly friendly towards their community. I understand the concern there. And I think everyone should be concerned whenever someone's transferring sensitive data and potentially using it in ways that it was not intended to be used for once it was acquired. I think that's a huge civil liberties issue.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I certainly don't want the government having too many of my private medical records, and especially considering how easy it is apparently for these data breaches to happen where outside parties get access to information as it's transferred digitally. I don't have a problem with these transgender patients launching an inquiry into why exactly their data was shared and the potential security issues related to that.
Yeah, I think in regard to the earlier part of this reporting here on the trans community, the fact that judges are ruling on gender-affirming healthcare is kind of interesting to me, because when I think of gender-affirming care, I do see it as something that is elective, and it's very hard for me to consider, a defense of spending public dollars on that when there are people that are being denied coverage that is necessary to save their lives. So I understand that criticism quite well. I can also understand why a judge might decide that it is, unconstitutional, that it is someone's right to privacy to maintain, that this is something that is medically necessary for them. This is something that they are going through. It's not something for the government to look into or make a judgment on. But when I think of private insurance companies, I don't see them covering gender-affirming care for the purpose that it is medically necessary. And I think that's a really interesting conversation to have, because I do see mental health care coverage as, medically necessary. And I can see a world where someone experiencing, gender dysphoria, someone who identifies as transgender, saying this is deeply affecting my mental health. I'm experiencing depression because I cannot transition, and then therefore it being ruled medically necessary. Do you need a note from a psychiatrist to receive this kind of care? I can see us getting into a space where that would make sense.
Yeah, this Medicaid case does raise a lot of important questions about the way that transgender health care or therapeutics are discussed, because a large part of the transgender community will claim that these are life-saving treatments because it alleviates whatever mental health concerns or gender dysphoria they may have. But the reality is that the science is still very much unproven on that aspect. There have not been any good blind studies of individuals who have gender dysphoria who undergo treatment and those who don't, who have the otherwise same characteristics. And the studies that have been done have so many fundamental flaws in them that they don't really tell us anything about the potential efficacy of these puberty blockers, hormone therapy, and surgical sex changes. And we do know that there are tons of negative side effects. So I think that the US should be following the European model, where Britain's NHS, or England's NHS rather, just released guidance on puberty blockers, for example, where they say that those will only be prescribed in clinical research settings, and they won't be prescribed as a matter of course to kids who are suffering from gender dysphoria. And tons of other European countries have followed suit. France, the Netherlands, I believe Denmark, have all decided to pull back a little bit on the idea of gender-affirming care, particularly for minors, because it is basically an experimental treatment at this point. And I think it's odd that Medicaid would be covering something that doesn't have proven benefits at this point. And I am imagining that this case and other cases where in Arkansas, for example, the ban on gender care for youth was overturned by a judge. These will probably end up going all the way to the Supreme Court.
Right. And I think it's unfortunate that many people who are taking action on the side of actually regulation on this front are people who are typically against the regulation of corporations in the United States and people who are fans of the free market. But when it comes to transgender issues, suddenly a lot of folks that don't usually care about regulation care about regulation. And that's coming from a place of being fearful of the transgender community and really feeling like you don't want to live in a society where there are a lot of visible transgender folks and people who are just not cisgender and don't fit the expectations of gender that we have. I don't think that's particularly helpful. I do think approaching this from the perspective of we want people who want this care to receive it safely, I think that makes sense. And that being explored in Europe, I think is huge. But I also do believe that a lot of countries in Europe have a more traditional view when it comes to gender than a lot of the major cities in the United States. And I think that could be at play there as well. Just the fact that the research is happening, I think is good. We get into a weird ethical territory when we think about some kind of randomized control trial we could run where we have a group of folks who do identify as transgender and we randomly select that half of the people in that pool receive gender affirming care or puberty blockers, and then we assess the different outcomes. I think we could see folks signing up for that kind of treatment, but I do think that there are definitely a group of people who are very devoted to their transition that would not sign up for something like this because they want the treatment so badly that they're willing to take the experimental treatment or puberty blockers or things that we don't really know the long-term side effects of. I think we would have the very devoted folks who are very sure of themselves and their path possibly not included in that study. And so there are all kinds of issues with conducting research on humans, especially when we're dealing with social issues, not just medical issues. So I think it's going to be always a difficult and precarious medical space.
Yeah, that was one of the biggest drawbacks of a major study out of a Seattle gender clinic, because they tried to adopt a blind study where they had a group that underwent puberty blockers and a group that didn't. But the problem was so many people in the group that didn't ended up dropping out of the study, which would suggest that it was because their gender dysphoria improved or their mental health improved. And so the comparisons couldn't be made properly because the control group was so much smaller in the end of the study than the group of people who did undergo the gender treatments with the puberty blockers. Meanwhile, famed author J.K. Rowling ruffled more feathers on Twitter yesterday after she weighed in on Elon Musk's ban of the terms cis and cisgender on the platform. The Harry Potter author tweeted, quote, "Cis is ideological language, signifying belief in the unfalsifiable concept of gender identity. You have a perfect right to believe in unprovable essences that may or may not match the sexed body, but the rest of us have a right to disagree and to refuse to adopt your jargon." To which Musk replied, quote, "Exactly." So what do you think? Is cisgender a slur, Jessica?
I definitely don't think it's a slur. I'm not sure what Elon Musk's point is. He uses really vague language with a lot of this stuff, but to say that gender identity is unfalsifiable is very interesting for him to confirm J.K. Rowling's sentiments there. It's interesting because it seems that this argument could be made, whatever gender identity you have, you are, regardless of your gender assigned or sex assigned at birth, right? The same argument could be taken in the direction of being, pro-trans rather than just using the word cisgender affirms trans folks exist and therefore should not be used. I think it's maybe more inclusive to just say gender is gender, whatever you identify as is what I'll call you. It seems to simplify the problem in the direction of social progress, in my opinion, rather than to say that there's a distinct difference between someone who is cisgender and someone who is transgender, and just to say a woman is a woman, a man is a man. What you identify with is what I'll call you. That works for me, but I don't think cisgender is a slur.
Yeah, I think what J.K. Rowling was trying to say is that cisgender, the term itself, perhaps gives weight to the idea that someone can change their gender, or that gender is necessarily divorced from sex, which I think critics of the transgender movement would say they don't agree with. I know that recent poll also found that 60% of Americans believe that it's morally wrong for people to change their gender. So adopting the term cis or cisgender to refer to people who are basically normal in regards to their behavior and their relationship with their sex assigned at birth, as you put it, or their body, is something that rubs a lot of people the wrong way.
Yeah, to me it seems like J.K. Rowling feels like she's getting left behind by clinging to this old idea of what gender is, and the use of cisgender is something that makes her feel uncomfortable because she's not willing to get with the times. That's honestly how I feel about J.K. Rowling's adversity towards the term cisgender. But we're going to have to leave it there, but we do have more rising after this.